This week, I'd like to talk about the Resilience Questionnaire. So last week, I took the ACE test, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences test. So if you're watching this show and you haven't seen the one on the ACE test, you should probably go back, because I don't know how much this is going to make sense to you. On the ACE test, if you hit a score of about a 4, you're looking at a person who is probably at risk. So from there, we want to be able to take a resilience questionnaire, because if you have resilience, it's an antidote to all the adverse childhood experiences. So the resilience questionnaire looks like this. You can also find this online. And it's 14 questions. And here's one of the really good parts about the resilience questionnaire. It has you look at things to where there might be some positives in your life that you can pay attention to or take a closer look at. And the best part of it is, you don't need a high score on this. You only need 1, and that's probably the most important thing. So let's go over the resilience questionnaire. And again, like last week, you have to be extremely honest about what's going on. So we have to put a little bit of the anger, maybe, put that to the side. Maybe there might be some bitterness. And also, I think it was Brene Brown who said the most courageous thing that you'll ever do is to own your own story. And part of owning your own story is owning the relationships you had with other people. First of all, they may have been abusive to you, but it also means you have to be open and honest about what maybe you're hanging on to, what might be your fault, and you might be not exactly looking at some of the positives that happened in your life. So let's take a look at this. Question number 1. I believe that my mother loved me when I was little. Now again, to be totally honest, that's the easiest question in the world. My mother, without a shadow of a doubt, loved me. As a matter of fact, I was told, because I wasn't there, but in high school, when asked what my mother wanted to do with her life, she only had one goal. She wanted to be a good mother. So I knew, beyond the shadow of a doubt, she wanted to be a mother. She loved being a mother. Number 2, I believe that my father loved me when I was little. And again, as noted, if you go back to the first show, I've said some really harsh things about my father. Totally true, though. But again, really thinking about this, did my father love me when I was little? All things being equal and being told, my father would say that the kids, me and my sister, were the biggest accomplishments of his life. So absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, my father loved me not only when I was little, but when I was older. Number 3. When I was little, other people helped my mother and father take care of me, and they seemed to love me. Now, I don't remember a lot of this when I was extremely little, but I did live with my grandparents. And so, yes, we had a big family, and I was definitely loved, and my sister was loved too. Number 4, I've heard that when I was an infant, somebody in my family enjoyed playing with me. Again, I don't know the answer to that. I'll probably say yes to it, but I don't have a memory, so I'm not gonna say yes. Number 5, when I was a child, there were relatives of my family who made me feel better if I was sad or worried. Again, absolutely. I had cousins. I remember a time when my parents were divorced, and my mom had to work, and she worked a lot. She worked 2 jobs, and I would have to be babysitted over at my aunt's house. And I remember I was a little kid looking for attention, and I must have swallowed some food or whatever, and I felt a little something in my chest, and I told everybody I was choking. Now, everybody knew I wasn't choking, I know that. But the funny thing is, nobody made fun of me. I remember it so clear. They had me lie down on the couch. They gave me like ginger ale or 7-Up or something and take little sips. And what they did was they even called a next door neighbor. And before you know it, between my cousins and next door neighbors, there must have been 10 people in that living room sitting with this little kid on a couch. And at some point I thought, well, I think I got enough attention for one day, and I told everybody I was fine. And I think back about that too, and there's a lot of things I think of, like when did our community start to go, that we don't even know our next door neighbors anymore? And that was a good thing too, so there were a lot of people around who cared about me. Number 7. Let's see. So yes, I had, when I was a child, neighbors or my friends' parents seemed to like me. And that was also true. Number 7, when I was a child, teachers, coaches, youth leaders, or ministers were there to help me. Again, absolutely true. I joined a football team when I was 8 years old. The coaches were amazing, and all my coaches were amazing. So I can't say a negative word about that. Teachers were very good. I can't complain about my teachers. I was never close to any of the ministers, but they were there if you needed to talk to them. Number 8, someone in my family cared about how I was doing in school. Yes, I was constantly told that if you want to be something, you have to get through school and you need to be college educated. So that was true. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you a quick little story here. I forgot what grade I was in, but I was definitely working out then. And I think I got an A in gym, and then I had 2 D's and 2 F's. My mother calls up my father comes over and he took away my weight set. Because I told him I was working out right after school, about 3:30 or so, all the way to 6 o'clock at night. And he's like, well, with all that time, why aren't you studying? And I thought, well, because I get a lot more attention and it seems to go much better for me when I'm a good athlete and I look good. That wasn't a good enough answer. So he took my weights away. I don't remember how long, but it definitely was from that period all the way to the next report card until I brought all my grades up. So yes, I did have a family that cared about me doing well in school. Number 9, my family, neighbors, and friends talked often about making our lives better. That one, not so much, I'd have to say. I didn't have neighbors that really talked like that because we were all in a low-income area, so I thought that they maybe were all depressed. So it's not like they were looking forward to bigger and better things. I think they were looking to survive. And in terms of family, it was interesting. My father, his parents, which were my grandparents, they referred to my uncle, my dad's brother, as the rich, famous hair salon owner, and my father was known as the other one. And I always felt like I was on the lower end, and my family was always on the lower end. So I don't think that they really understood. I'm not gonna say they didn't care, but I don't think they really understood the position we were in. So I'm gonna say that one would be no. Number 10, we had rules in our house and were expected to keep them. Now that's an interesting one too, because honestly, I followed the rules all the time, but we really didn't have any rules. The rules were that if you broke a rule, you were going to get in trouble. And because you were taught between right and wrong, but I wasn't told exactly what time to go to bed. I wasn't told all these things. And I had made a decision when I was very young that because my parents were divorced and my mother had a lot of problems, I was not going to be another one to her. So I tried to do everything as perfect as I could. So in a sense, let me say there were rules, although my mother never really had to enforce those because I enforced them on myself. Number 11, when I felt really bad, I could almost always find somebody I trusted to talk to. Another interesting one, if I'm being fully honest. The answer to that is yes and no. Yes, I could talk to my mother. Yes, I could talk to my father, and I can trust them that they would do the best they can to help me. But I didn't really trust them in a situation because of the situation that we were in. I really couldn't talk to my parents about how to make money in the world. I couldn't talk to them about business. I couldn't talk to them about maybe being more popular because these are the things that they didn't have. And I felt that I was going to have to do something different than the way they were living their life. So I could trust that they loved me and they cared about me and they were worried about my well-being. But when it came to certain things in life, I had to go to other people if I really wanted to know the answers to things. So the answer to that is yes and no. Question number 12. As a youth, people noticed that I was capable and I could get things done. Again, absolutely. Because my mother was in a difficult situation and there wasn't a lot of joy in her life other than her kids, I tried to make sure as much as I could that she had a joyous time. And by 6th grade, I was already a spelling bee champion. I got an award for being best athlete. I was the county champion of wrestling. I was already the captain of a football team. And that's not to brag, by the way. That's actually part of the trauma because I refused to be anything less than what I could be. And I tried harder than every kid because I was trying to make sure that my mother had a good life. And I was trying to make sure that my dad was proud of me. So those things was noticed by all the teachers, was noticed by all the coaches and anybody I was around. As a matter of fact, it was a little hard to deal with it as I got older because most of the coaches I had, thought I'd be a professional at some point. And of course that never happened. So, that's a little hard to let people down there. Number 14. I believe that life is what you make it. Again, being honest, another interesting question. I think as a person who is naturally stoic, life is what you make it. Yes, of the things that you can control, I decided to try to control them as much as I could. What I couldn't control was a certain amount of kids having already a nice house, having their college education paid, having their transportation of their cars paid for. So it's both. Yes, you can do everything possible to improve your life, but there are things that are not under your control. So I don't call that being negative. I call that being a realist. So as we go through all this, I didn't count all of the ones I said yes to because there were obviously too many. I think out of 14, I think I said like 11 or 12 yeses. So what does that mean? It means that I have a lot of resiliency factors that helps me with all the adverse childhood experiences that I had. So it does more than buffer it. Now again, you only need one. You just need one to hang on to. And I have multiple. And most people do have a lot of resilience behind them. They just forgot to look at it. So one of the things I want to say about the resilience test where you only need just one yes is if you're out there right now and you're listening to this and you are a mother, a father, anybody, and you want to help somebody, all you have to do is be decent or be loving or be caring or be empathetic or compassionate or supportive of one person. And you can be that one person of resilience that they need. And by changing one person's life, you can change the world. So my question to you is, why wouldn't you do it? How easy is it to be decent to a person? Is it really difficult to listen to a 7-year-old tell you about their dreams? Because that's all they need. They need somebody to see them, and they need somebody to show them that they actually care, that they have a voice, that somebody cares about their dreams. That's all you need to do. You don't need to do anything. You just need to be present. I think we're all capable of that. So if you know that on a resilience test that you only need to be there and you need just one, be that one person in their life. I have a few other thoughts on how to rise above adverse childhood experiences. And I like to call it a combination of inner defiance, and I want to talk about not abandoning yourself, because I see this over and over. If you go back to the last video, you'll hear that I talked about some things were physically abusive to me. One of them was on the sexual side. But here's the thing. What that person did to me in that locker room was in no way my fault. What it did was, it showed me that he was a sick individual. very dysfunctional. And what it showed me is that I need to get a little bit stronger next time to defend myself, right? And when my father was abusive to me, it didn't mean that I was a bad kid. It meant that he had something going on with him. So another person's bad behavior is not your bad behavior. And another person's bad behavior doesn't make you a bad person. And the only reason why it does is because for some reason, and there's other reasons we can get into it later, but people abandon themselves. They assume that the perpetrator is the good person and they're the bad person. But if you think about it long enough, what sense does that make? None. How does it help you? It does not. So you always have to have inner defiance and don't abandon who you are. Number 2, find a positive influence. Now again, you just need one, as we did on the resilience test. Argument's sake, let's say you don't have any. Fair enough, some people don't. Aristotle, a couple of thousand years ago, had the answer. If you don't have a role model, pick one. It doesn't have to be somebody from your family or your church. If you don't know the person, it doesn't matter. I had a couple of role models as well. The first time I watched Pumping Iron, it changed my life. I wanted to be a bodybuilder. I had no bodybuilders in my family. That wasn't a thing. Who is my role model? Everybody's gonna say Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? Absolutely not. I didn't have anything in common with a guy who was like 6'2", 6'3", and he was Austrian. I just didn't have it. But Lou Ferrigno was Italian and from New York. And he was deaf when he was younger. And I have had 3 ear operations to be able to get to a decent amount of hearing, which of course I still disrespect it because I listen to loud music all the time. And I continue to make myself even more deaf. But that's beside the point. So Lou Ferrigno, to me, although I've never met him, not in my family, Italian guy from New York who was a bodybuilder and who was deaf and had trouble speaking, I adopted him. Franco Colombo, he's about 5'5", short, Italian, bodybuilder and boxer. Totally related to him. Another one of my idols. Pictures on my walls, absolutely. And I followed what they did as bodybuilders to be better. Overall, Franco Colombo was also a chiropractor. He's a doctor. So did I want to follow him in terms of intelligence? Absolutely. So it's not an excuse to say that there's nobody in your family to look up to. Find one. There's plenty of role models in the world. Number 3, accept the love and the support that's given to you. I can't tell you how many times I've sat with people eyeball to eyeball wanting to give them help. I can't tell you how many times I've made phone calls to people because somebody in their family or even them wants me to call them to help save them or help them in some way. Whether they're on drugs, alcohol, they're treating themselves poorly, they have anger issues. You want to know how many times they called me back? Less than 50%. Maybe less than 20%. You know what? Probably less than 10%. I have worked in alcohol and drug rehab centers where somebody's parents have sent a person to a rehab center for $5,000 a month and they've sent them there 10, 12, 15 times. Listen, the parents might be dysfunctional for all I know, and a lot of times they are because the environment is not very good. But I do know this, they are trying. And when they are at the center, they have more help than anybody will ever have. They've got 10 to 15 people looking after them 24 hours a day. And how often does it help? Not much, because they refuse to accept the love and the care and the support that they're given. And I could be there all day long, and I could be the best motivational speaker in the world, and somebody else could be too. Listen, you can listen to Tony Robbins 15 times a day, every day for the rest of your life, saying that you're enough and you're great and you can do it. And if you continue to think, no, I'm not, too bad, I'm just going to do whatever I want to do, then you win in that sense, right? Like no one could help you. And that's to me probably the worst thing. That will always stop you from ever getting better. And on the good side of that is, the reason why people don't get better is because they don't want to. That's the real answer. They don't allow people to help them. And that's the truth of it. Number 4, possibly the biggest one, I don't know. It's a big deal in my life. I'm not telling anybody else how to think or what to do. I understand that there's a lot of therapists who don't actually believe in forgiveness. They want you to hold on to your power, supposedly. If you want to hold on to that anger and bitterness, that's okay. I'm not telling you what to do or what not to do. I would invite you to consider that forgiveness might be a good way to go. But don't do it halfway. That's why forgiveness doesn't work sometimes. It's because someone says you need to forgive, and they go, okay, I forgive so-and-so for what they did. Right, but until you make an honest, full list of all the grievances of how you were hurt by a particular individual and lay them out, you're not forgiving them fully for their things. You have to lay out the issues. So if you watch my show again from last week on the ACE test, I said some things about my father. You can look at me or possibly and go, how in the world can he say such horrible things about somebody in his family? And I'll tell you, without laying it out openly and honestly, you can't forgive. Because if you can't verbalize it, and you don't have the courage to own your whole story, you can't forgive. So that's number 1, if you want to forgive. An honest, full list of your grievances. That's number 1. Number 2, empathy. Here's where the empathy is. It's not all about you. You're not perfect, and the people who hurt you are not perfect. I'll give you an example for my mother. My mother was a very loving, caring person. In some ways, she had a little bit of social anxiety. She had low self-esteem, and so growing up, it was hard for me to have a certain amount of self-esteem because she couldn't teach it to me, right? And she didn't necessarily, she did her best, and she was a great mother, but in terms of that, it was a little difficult. But here's the thing, her father was in the Marines. He was never around. He actually died in Tokyo. And throughout her life, her mother was an alcoholic. And she would tell me stories that her mother was never home. My mother, when my grandmother was drunk and passed out, my mother would go over and shave her head. She would shave her head. And she would do this to make my mother supposedly look ugly, because then my grandmother would be a lot less likely to go to the bar. But that was my mother, as I'm thinking, she was probably very, very young at that time. My mother was extremely traumatized as a young girl. And she didn't have a male role model as well because there was nobody around. And so it made my mother not have a lot of self-esteem, and she attracted a man, my father, who was a lot more dominating and domineering. To talk about my father was full-blooded Sicilian, his father, my grandfather, never had a conversation with him. He just knew that he was aggravated when he took off one of his shoes and would throw it at him, or throw some other object that was handy. That's about the length of the conversation that my father had. So he had a lot of difficulty, and he told me that, of trying to listen to me. And I have to reward and really say great things about my dad, because he really went out of his way to be a better man throughout his life. And so who am I to blame him for any of my troubles? It's my job to take what he gave me, which was an improvement upon his father, and then I am allowed to try to improve on what my father has done. So I don't have any ill will towards my father at all. And I'm going to go a step further. Again, pointing to the stories that my father did not want me to be a person who ever cried, who ever had feelings, ever had emotions, and he would beat it into me. But here's the other part. Men back then were allowed to hit their kids, it was not something that was considered to be overly abusive back then. I used to get hit by teachers back then. So, you have to look at it in terms of the culture of what was going on. Also back then, the DSM, or let's just say the American Psychology Association, deemed that being gay was a psychological illness, and most people thought that. And one of the ways they thought you could turn gay is to not have a father around. Well, at the time when my parents divorced, it was only 1970. My father thought that he could beat it into me to make me a man because he did not want me to be gay. And that sounds ridiculous in the year 2020. But he believed it. And a lot of people believed it. And if he had thought to go to a library to look it up, the American Psychology Association would have backed him up. If you can believe that, it's totally true. So my father did things in order to make me a tougher boy, because he knew that that's the way the society was, and he thought that being raised by a woman would make me too feminine and I wouldn't be a good man. And the other part that I also forgive him for is that when you track back on the years, my father did his worst damage to me, so to speak. He was like 22 years old. Okay, so I'm going to judge a man for the whole extensiveness of his whole life based on some things he did when he was like 22 or 23 years old. Does that make sense? That I need to lean on that? That's ridiculous. And let me go this way too. If you're a person who doesn't want to forgive because you don't have empathy for the people who may have hurt you, I understand. I do understand. But on the other side, don't expect your kids or your friends or people in your life to have empathy for you when you make mistakes. Because I think things go around. You have to understand that everybody makes mistakes. And if you're not willing to forgive a person for their mistakes, why should anybody be willing to forgive you? And the last part of forgiving is that, how about being grateful for the things that you've learned? Through my father and my mother, I've been able to take a couple of lessons, is that if you want to be a really strong man, but eliminate the feminine side of you, you end up being a very abusive, overly macho guy that really nobody wants to be around. But if you can be a real man and also have that feminine side and allow that to be expressed, you can also be a man who's got a lot of power, but also has a lot of love and compassion. And so you can be a fully rounded human being. And also when the chips are down, I've handled adversity, so adversity doesn't bother me anymore. And that's what also, I can sit in front of somebody who's going through great difficulty, when I'm doing therapy with people. And I can be of service and I can be a good help because I have been through it. You can read all the books you want, but unless you go through it, you don't really have a knowledge of how to accept it and to confront it and to grow from it. So I think that's all I want to say today about rising above your adverse childhood experiences. But I think I'll build off of this. I've got a few more things I want to say about forgiveness and some other things. I'll get into that at a later time. Thanks for listening.